Good evening. I call the December 5th Development Review Board meeting to order. We have some administrative matters to deal with first. I'm looking to approve the minutes of the previous two meetings, so we're looking to approve the minutes for the November 7th meeting.
So moved.
Seconded.
Second.
Anyone have any comments or adjustments to those, changes to those minutes? Okay, there being no changes. All those in favour?
Aye.
Those against?
I have to abstain, I was here.
Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5, 1, 1. Okay, now I'm looking for a motion to approve the minutes of the November 21st meeting.
So moved.
Thank you. And seconded?
Second.
Seconded. Anybody have any comments or changes for the November 21st?
I'm sorry,
Meetings.
that's the one I wasn't here for. The other one I was. It's been a very confusing month.
No comments? Looking to a motion, for a motion to, all those in favour?
Aye.
Those against? Abstaining? 5, 1, 1. Okay. Okay, at the DRB, we hear applications for land development in the town of Brattleboro and appeals of zoning administrator's decisions. I'll start just a little bit about the procedure. The Development Review Board operates on the record. Broadly, what this means is that we take a clear record of testimony from the applicant and any interested parties, and then issue a written decision with our findings. The applicant or applicants and members of the public, just 1 second, we'll let Dr. Chard join us. Good evening, Dr. Chard.
Good evening.
Applicants and the members of the public should be aware that this is your opportunity to comment and provide evidence relating to applications. In the event of an appeal of our decision to the Environmental Court, the Court will not take additional testimony, but will look at the evidence from our hearings, the regulations, and determine if the evidence supports the Board's decision. So I encourage all of you to speak up now at this hearing and get your comments on the record. Something which I often forget to do, there's a sign-in sheet somewhere, or there normally is a sign-in sheet, is that correct, Brian? It's circulating. Please put your name and details onto the sign-in sheet. As we are on the record, we're going to ask that you affirm that your testimony will be truthful. So would anybody, the applicants and anybody wishing to speak to an application, please stand and affirm the following. I hereby affirm that the evidence I give in the cause under consideration should be the whole truth and nothing but the truth, under the pains and penalties of perjury. I do.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Brian, has the meeting been properly warned?
Yes, it has.
Do we have, board members, do we have any disclosure of conflicts of interest or ex parte communications?
I do. My firm has represented an abutter of the applicant in application 2011-212 in matters related to that property, so I'll be recusing myself on that matter.
Okay. Does anybody else have any conflicts of interest or ex parte communications?
Do you want to sit?
My point 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So, Michael, you're appointed for application 2011-212. At this point, I call application, we'll open the public hearings and we'll call application 2011-212, Brattleboro Auction Corporation for Tarmy Properties. Please come forward to the seat up front and tell us about your project.
We have put in an application to have an auction at the lot at 39 Hardwood Way. We would like to hold 2 to 3 auctions per week there.
And this property is off of Putney Road?
It is
On,
on Putney Road, yes.
Okay.
Right behind McDonald's and Kentucky Fried Chicken.
Okay. And when do you anticipate holding the auctions? In the daytime, the evening, or?
In
It'd
the
be-
evening,
Yeah, it'd be
Oh.
from 6, starts at 6.
Okay. What, and how many people, what's your anticipated attendance for these auctions?
the attendance,
It would be
100
50 to 75 probably to start with.
50 to
New
70?
new area, you really never know how many people show up, you know, at an auction. Usually the average is 50 to 75.
And might I ask what kind of auctions there'll be? Are they're it's furniture or?
Furniture,
or
yeah.
goods,
General merchandise.
General merchandise.
Yeah,
No cars, no
no.
Antiques, furniture, stuff like
no animals?
that.
No.
Okay. And access to that lot is
Hardwood,
on Hardwood Way?
yes.
Are there any other accesses to or from that lot? I mean,
No.
that's the way that people will come to attend the auction, and that's the way they'll
Yes.
leave.
Yep.
I haven't visited that lot, but that's is that paved or is it gravel?
Yes, it's paved.
It's paved.
Are there parking spaces marked on the pavement?
Some are, some are not.
And that building was what, formerly offices, or was it?
It was formerly a used car lot.
Mark's Motors. Right.
Yes.
Brian, an auction house is a conditional use in the district, or
Yes.
approved use in the district?
Conditional use.
Is there circulation all the way around the building? The fire department has noted that they want to keep a fire lane
Yeah, the
clear
fire.
around the building.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's a access or circulation all the way around the building?
Goes all the way around,
You
yes.
you can drive all the way around the building.
And where are the loading doors or loading dock?
Be right out in the
In-
front. Well, on the side, actually, it'd be on the side part. It's, Parking lot.
That-
It's on the parking lot side.
That's on the north side of the building.
It is on the west side. The overhead doors.
Yeah, that little piece of the building that's showing, you know, jutting out.
That part
It's just-
is where you enter through a small door, a regular sized door, and then there's two overhead doors on either side of it. And you would be entering the two, the loading is on the two on the south side of the outlet of the building.
So it's on the side marked 100 feet on this plan.
It's the little
It's-
outlet, and then there's a straight area.
On the southern, okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
What kind of trucks do you anticipate will come and go from the building?
It'd be like a box truck. It's a
box trucks?
16-footer.
And-
It
and
won't be no
are you-
bigger than that. no.
Are you going to utilize the whole building, the entire building, or just part of it?
Just
It's half of it.
And the other half, or the rear half, remains what?
Does it? What's it?
What's in the other half of the building?
There's a body shop in
Oh.
one part of it, and the other part is an artist studio.
Is one bathroom sufficient for this?
I don't see a bathroom here.
I don't know that we have a
Oh, really?
requirement to set the number of bathrooms.
I haven't heard of, I don't remember. Is there any, Brian, is there any requirement for the number of bathrooms in a place like?
There might be as part of the state building code, but we don't have any local regulations.
Excuse me?
There might be as part of the state building code, but we don't have any regulations on a local level.
What are the hours for the body shop?
He works like half days. He's usually there early in the morning for a few hours. He usually cuts out around 2 o'clock or so.
So he's not going to be there the same time the auctions are going on?
No, I've never seen their meeting.
Concerned about travel.
Are there any, do you know if there are any handicap spaces marked at this point in time?
Yes, there is.
I think
There are?
they're not marked.
It's not marked.
No.
It's not marked, but they will
There will be.
There
You
will
will have
be. We
handicap
are going to
spaces?
have that marked, yes.
Okay. And are you doing any construction there?
No,
Modifications to the building? Any changes in lighting?
no,
Changes in landscaping?
no, no.
And how many parking spaces are there outside, do you know?
There's approximately 50 to 60.
50 to 60 spaces?
Yeah. There might be a little more there, but we're figuring a little on.
And that's 50 to 60 existing spaces that are already marked?
They're
a
not
mar-
really marked out,
There's-
all of them.
There's 15, I believe, that are marked out.
And just remind me, you said that you expected between 50 and 75 people, or 50 to 80 people to attend the auctions?
Yes.
We would,
Of course, the guy next door, on the end of the building said the parking could extend down his way, and it wouldn't bother him a bit.
One of the things the board does is we don't like to have excessive parking when it's not needed. So I think if there were 20 spaces marked plus the handicap spaces for the purposes of the auction house, that would be adequate.
Okay.
If you get more people and they have to spread over, then clearly there's space on site to do it. So the fire department has requested that there is a posted fire lane around the entire building, but it would seem that you're only about to occupy half of the building.
Right.
Is there a fire lane in existence around the rest of the building?
I think when everything went through, we always have to maintain that for the fire department, access to all the way around. It's never blocked, ever.
Okay.
But it's not marked.
There's a request that it's posted, that it's marked from Chief Picossi, so... There's also a request from the fire department about clarifying the 911 listing for the premises. It would appear that there's been some issue in the past, or it's not totally clear, or... Does any other members of the board have questions for the applicant?
Yeah.
Please do.
I noticed that fire department said there'd likely be requirements for a sprinkling system and emergency exit. Have they actually made that requirement?
No.
That word likely is,
No.
how do we resolve that one?
I don't see it I don't see it on Mike Picotti's request.
Yeah, we got emergency.
Oh. Wait a
Yeah.
minute, wait a minute.
It said
Yeah, we got
must submit for a state fire prevention construction permit.
We got emergency exit on the side, too.
There's emergency exit and emergency lighting in there now.
Am I possibly looking at the wrong?
I don't know what you're looking at.
Have you got on your sheet? Tim, on your sheet, you have something about just ADA compliance?
Yes.
Well, if you do, then you go up from there where it says higher safety, and within the paragraph.
Yep. Well, we will condition the permit on obtaining a construction permit or safety permit from the State Department of Fire Safety, so if they require that at that point in time. Might be because he doesn't ask for it on his memo, specifically. Catherine? At this point, I'll ask if any members of the public wish to comment on this application.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Rich Parra, I represent one of the abutters, P&R Associates LLC. They own the office building, it's marked office building on the plat that you have there. The main concern we have, and we've had some good discussions already with the applicants and also Mr. Tarmy, the property owner, but my client's had some difficulties with the former tenant on that piece of property regarding their parking area. There's a well-paved and well-lit parking area behind the office building. And the former tenant in the building, Mark's Motors or whoever it was, would fairly routinely bring car carriers back through there. And it was a significant problem for the tenant in our building at times. We've spoken with the applicants and we've spoken with Mr. Tarmy as well. We don't anticipate that that's going to be a problem now, but they've made some suggestions to us about what they plan to do to funnel their customers into the parking lot and back of the building. In terms of signage, I talked with Mr. Tarmy about perhaps a temporary sign on auction nights, mounted on a sawhorse or something like that, on, by the access, and also a permanent type sign, perhaps on the side of the building, also showing the auction customers where the parking for that building was going to be. They're not included on the plan, however, so I would like, if possible, to see exactly where those signs are going to be, and at the board's discretion, obviously, see if those could become part of the conditions under which the permit's granted. Again, we don't have any problem with the use of the building and the application in general. Just concerned that the parking problems we've had in the past aren't repeated.
So, Rich, the office building you referred to is the one between this property and Putney Road?
Correct.
On the south side of Hardwood Way?
Exactly. And that, on the plan, you see the driveway sort of running down the south side of the building here. The other side of that driveway on the south side of it is our parking area. And they've spent considerable amount of money, my clients, redoing that parking area, paving the whole thing. There's 5 or 6, I believe, down shielded lights for the parking area. So there's a couple of which have had to be replaced, actually, because of the car carriers bumping into them. But again, we don't anticipate that problem now. Again, we've had discussions with the applicants. They appear to be very conscientious about making sure that their customers are going to use the parking available to them. But we would like to see a more complete description of what they have in mind for signage to funnel those customer cars into the back of the building. The temporary and the permanent signage, and to make those part of the part of the permit. Right, yeah. The only reason I mention that is Tim, sort of as my amateur psychology, the entrance to the auction portion of the building itself is on the south side of the building, which is what faces our parking lot. So just as somebody driving in and looking at where the auction is, you tend to park on the side of the building where the entrance is, in general, rather than parking in back and walking around. So that's why we're concerned that the signage makes it very clear that the auction patrons are to, park behind the building, even though the entrance is on the opposite side of the building from where the parking is.
And in your assessment, is there an optimum place to put a parking sign? Or a no parking sign? Or?
Well, we can certainly take care of the no parking except for the, tenants of our building only, but this is happening after hours from our tenants' point of view. Yep. The auctions are taking place in the evenings, they're regular business hours for our tenants. When I spoke with Mr. Tarmy, I thought his idea of a temporary sign, on auction nights that essentially is blocking access to our parking area and pointing towards the auction parking is a great idea.
So a sandwich board
That's what
style thing which has got auction parking and an arrow?
Yeah, I mean,
like
ideally for me, and this may not be feasible for the applicant, is I would like to see the entrance door on the north side of their building rather than the south side. But that may not be feasible, I don't know. But, in a perfect world, that's what I would like to see, that the entrance to the auction is on the same side of the building as their parking.
Okay, I'm confused.
Oh, yeah, I get that. That's a good point that Joe's made. I'm not sure about from the hours of operation if there's going to be preview hours where folks would be available, would be coming to view items that that will be for sale at the auction, prior to the auction itself. Typically, those would happen earlier in the day, I guess.
Yeah, like 3 o'clock usually.
Okay.
And most of them preview on the website, on Auction Zip. They can preview pretty much everything, ahead of time.
So again, it would have to be, I suppose, even during the regular business hours where our tenants are utilizing our parking area, there would have to be some indication that the auction patrons use the other parking area behind the building.
Could you clarify where the entrance is again for me on this plan, exactly?
Yeah.
I thought the entrance was on the west side, but it's now been inferred that the entrance is on the south side.
Right.
Well, I'm sorry, Tim, if you look at that little bump out on the west side,
Yep.
at least the way I read this map, the entrance door is on the
south side of that.
little bump
that
out.
bump out.
Exactly.
But there is to be no parking on the true south side of the building. There's no marked spaces on the south side of the building
No.
as it interfaces to Hardwood Way.
No, there's no parking on that side of the building.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim.
Were there any other members of the public that, please, yes, Mark, step up.
Mark Current Properties. I talked at length with Eve, who's the tenant of the building, because the previous tenant we had was really disrespectful to his wishes, and so we made really clear our desire to make sure that everything went well. And so we've had several meetings about where to put signboards in front, and we talked to Rich about putting a sign in front. The parking and the entrance are on the same side of the building, which is the east side. That's where the majority of the parking is, and the overflow parking goes to the north side of the building. There can't be any parking on the south side because that's a right-of-way. And we've actually, in talking to the people here about the auction, they've talked about announcing at auctions to make sure that people park where they're supposed to, and at the point, even in the beginning, about putting a person out on auction evenings to make sure that people go into the right areas. But also we always talked about that on the days of the auction that we have signboards and stuff put up so that people know then that, so because the tendency would be to come in and take a right and park into the that office building's parking lot. So we've been talking at length about making sure that that happens.
Okay, thank you. Any other members of the public wish to speak to this application? Okay. Signage would appear to be something that's not in your application and should be discussed. Signage with regard to parking and signage overall. I take it you're going to want to put a sign on the building that says auction house or something? Is that been applied for, Brian?
Yes, we have usage of a sign out in front near the Putney Road.
Right,
There's a off-site ground sign?
One of those sign, I don't know what you call them, where you can put different
Yep.
names in. There's one of that in front of at the Rhodes Scholar Building where we can put a sign in there, and then any other sign would be off-road signage where they would just say auction house on it or whatever.
What about will there be a wall sign on the building?
I don't think so.
A banner?
A banner?
Maybe
Can
a
we put
banner. Maybe I'm not sure. We're not.
on the building
There's no
itself?
plans for that type of signage at this point.
So if somebody is attending the auction and they see the sign on the Putney Road and they drive down Hardwood Way, what is going to indicate that it's the building on the left?
As you come to the end of Hardwood Way and around that corner, there's going to be a sandwich board
We're
with a
going to have a
sign
sandwich board.
on no parking and an arrow directing them across the front of the building to the other side.
Okay. You will need to fill another form out for a sign permit, whether that be something, a ground sign, or a wall sign, or a sandwich board. No, you know, that's a temporary basis parking, and you'll have to get administrative approval for that, and tell Brian where you're going to post it or where you're going to place it on auction days or nights. We'd like to see an updated plan too that shows, if you could show clearly where the entrance is, where the 20 spaces for parking are going to be, the ones that are going to be for the auction house, where the handicap spaces are going to be, and where you propose to put that sign.
Okay.
All right? What about lighting on the building for the evenings? Is there existing lighting over the doorways or?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah, yep,
Yeah?
yep.
Is there parking lot lighting?
Yes, there is.
There is?
Yeah.
Could you note the positions of that on the plan too? Where the parking lot lights are and the door lights are? Just make a little...
Okay.
So we have a site plan with a bit more information on it. Any other questions from the board?
Yeah, there's you notice there's a dumpster? There's one dumpster there. Is that for KFC and the office building and your building?
No, I think that's yours, isn't it? That dumpster?
That dumpster belongs to the office, the other office, but it's not our dumpster.
Okay, so how do you plan
The office building on the other side?
The Rhodes Scholar Building, that's their dumpster.
Okay.
And it's got a fence around it.
Can they show
The
that?
plan shows that.
It doesn't.
It's all fenced in.
Do you have a dumpster associated with your...
Not at the present time.
Do you plan to have one?
Well, I don't know.
I don't think so.
I don't think,
We'll just
think
truck around and say, if we get a dumpster, then too many people like to just dump stuff there.
Yeah.
So we got, you know, box truck.
The idea is to auction stuff, right?
Yeah, they won't
Sell
sell
it.
it on us.
Okay, I'm looking for... Anything further from... Looking for a motion to approve the application 2011-212 with some of the conditions that we just talked about.
Move. So move.
Second.
Moved and seconded. All those in favour?
Aye.
Those against? I abstain. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 0, 1. Thank you very much.
Are we still here in the black book? Or is that
That's continued. Or will be continued.
Okay. Just wondering.
Okay, I call application 2011-218 Brattleboro Housing Authority continued from November 21st. I will do. Was it 7 on the board? 1, 2, 3, 7, so we have to appoint.
There's us. What?
Michael, what do you think of it?
They must not be everyone else's.
Any other? 1, 2, 3, 4, no, 5, 6, 7. Oh no, we're 7. We're full board.
Oh, we have 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We have 8.
So I don't have to point.
Yeah.
Okay. Michael, you're not appointed to this application because we have a full board.
No.
This is some information.
Okay, thank you, sir. Oh, wait, this is all just one package.
Okay, before we start, I have a few remarks or comments relating to this application. At the last meeting, I'd like to kind of try and keep it on topic and fairly tight. The last meeting we went on for some period of time, and members of the public ended up departing or leaving before they had an option to talk. We're at 7:30 right now, so hopefully we won't be at 10 o'clock or whatever when they have to leave, or when people might have to leave. Secondly, I'd like to just remind people that this is a hearing that was continued from a previous meeting. We took quite a lot of testimony at that previous meeting. Members of the board that were not at that meeting, Stephen in particular, has reviewed the DVD of that meeting, so they will be sitting on this application. This continued hearing is focusing on a fairly narrow issue of a substantial damage determination. There are a number of things that we really aren't considering at this hearing. And we're not considering whether or not people are in harm's way. We're not considering whether we're going to remove property from the floodway. We are not considering whether we're keeping residents out of their homes. We're not considering what software tools we used in the original determination. What we are concerned with are the figures used in the calculation to determine substantial damage. There are two figures in that calculation, and they are the normal market costs to restore the buildings to pre-flood condition and the market value of the buildings. So the board is focused on determining those numbers, those figures, so that we can determine the percentage for substantial damage. And the last point is that even though the application was broad in terms of originally 5 properties or 5 buildings there, we will consider each of the properties separately. So even though we may talk in generalities, the decision will ultimately come down to an evaluation on a property or structure-by-structure basis. Having said that, I ask the applicant to tell us. Oh, sorry, one second.
Ask if there are more people who need to be sworn in.
Have we had anybody that's joined us since the...
I haven't sworn in.
You were not sworn in yet.
No, I came in about 5 after.
Are there other people?
We won't swear in.
Okay. In that case, if you're an interested party or a member of the applications team, then I'd need to ask you to affirm that the evidence you give is truthful. So if you wouldn't mind standing. I hereby affirm that the evidence I give in the cause under consideration shall be the whole truth and nothing but the truth under the pains and penalties of perjury. I do. Thank you very much. Thank you, Spoon, for that.
Okay, I'm Mary Houghton. I'm the finance manager at the Housing Authority. After the meeting of November 7th, when this matter was continued, you asked us to come back with numbers for the costs that were clear and consistent. So we asked Bob Stevens of Stevens & Associates to work with our contractor, John Brunel, and to look at the scope and make sure that the scope of work on the buildings made sense, and then to go through the cost estimates and make sure that those made sense. In addition, we also looked at the market values of the buildings, and the result of all that is the submission of November 28th that was passed on to you, right, Brian? They got this, Bob's submission. So I think I'll let Bob talk about it.
Okay, thank you for giving us a chance to sort of go back and look at this submission in a little more detail. Suffice to be said that we've been going through a little bit of a learning curve, all of us, in terms of what, in fact, the rules and regulations and guidelines are under the FEMA guidelines for damage and improvements. You know, just a little bit of background and history, and I think just from my own perspective, I think it's pretty clear that back in August, at the time of the flood, none of us really understood how this works. And it's important to recognize that, just to understand how we got to where we are today. You know, actions were taken, renovations were started. The planning department figured it out first, started trying to communicate that they needed data. The housing authority submitted data, and at that time, really not fully understanding how that data needed to fit within the categories, I think it was really self-evident that the planning department had no choice but to determine that it was a substantially damaged building, because we gave them data that was high and they had values that were low. And that's really where you ended up. I think that what we've been able to do since then, and what's in this submission, is what we think is really a more realistic percent of value for damages and improvements. And there's a couple of things that go into that analysis. I'm not going to go through the whole submission because it's there. I'm sure you've sort of gone through it. But some of the key issues are starting with the value of the property. As we said in our submission, there really is not a lot of guidance in the source documents for these regulations, your zoning ordinance or the federal actual language for the law. There are some guidelines that give you some rules of how you might go about that. And in general, in our view, from reading those documents, there are three different types of ways to come up with the market value of the building. We started with the assessed value, which is a legitimate value and for tax purposes, and to some degree to determine percent of damage. The last time we were here, we submitted an appraised value, which is another value for how this building might work in the marketplace. This time, we've gone and developed, with some effort, what is referred to as an actual cash value for this building. And it is a third method of determining value, which is really based upon determining what it would cost to build this building in today's dollars, the same building, and then looking at depreciation of that. You'll see some of the sources that we talk about, and I personally think that this is probably the only method that starts looking and comparing apples and apples. We're giving you cost to replace a component of a building and comparing that against values that have nothing to do with building this building. This actual cash value is in fact that. You're starting from what it costs to build the building, appreciating that for the age and condition that it's in, and then comparing that to the cost of repairing the damages or the cost of improvements. Suffice to say that we went about that. We actually hired a professional cost estimator. This is how we do it in the construction industry. And we used depreciation values that we think are consistent. They're certainly consistent with what our council recommends to us, as well as what the last submission that came through on the assessment. So the market value resulted, using the actual cost value and depreciation, in a higher value for these properties. And that's one factor in looking at this. We then went and looked at the cost of damages and the cost of improvements. And I wanted to say first that the first thing we did is we started to go through and separate what were improvements and what was damages. We are obligated to fix all the damages back to before flood condition or as was condition, as it's referred to in the industry. We are not necessarily required to do the improvements. Some of the improvements got started because we didn't know this in the beginning. Some of those improvements haven't been done, and we feel we have the option to not do those. So we went through and we separated things like the improvements. They were mixed in with the other numbers. We were painting ceilings. We were adding insulation for soundproofing. You know about the showers that were being put in. We were replacing upper cabinets. All of these had nothing to do with the damage, and they were inflating the cost of this project. So some of the upper cabinets hadn't been removed. Some of the cabinets that have been removed we're not putting back. We were able to go back through and say, we're going to reduce the scope of that work and reduce the cost of the improvements while still doing replacing all the damages. On the damages to the property, we went back through and looked at what was in that category of things. Some of them was really an effort of going in and measuring more accurately to get accurate volumes. Where the last submission there were allowances for replacement of items, of subcontractors' costs. We've now had time to go out and get actual proposals from contractors, submissions of materials, costs from suppliers, really narrowing this down to just a few things that are hourly rates to get this cost as tight as we could. We did make some value adjustments. They're indicated in the submission. You know, again, looking at pre-primed doors, things that were replacing it to previous value but didn't cost as much. So we felt that it was within our discretion to find ways to save money and still get the same value at the end of the day. And we have a long list of those. We're happy to go through them if that's an issue, but I'll spare you the details unless you want to go through that. So again, consistent with, well, let me just note there were several things that were not in that number the last time as well. There was some outside work that was pointed out, the stoop, the railings, overhead and profit, supervision. All of those numbers were picked up and added to this cost that were not in the last one. We leveled out the labor rates to be $52 an hour, which was the same as in the rest of the project, which I would add is probably fairly high. We also, we did, however, adjust a factor that I would refer to as emergency room rates. In the cost of this project, it's our position that paying for overtime, paying for overhead and profit of 20% are things that are not normal and customary to the market cost of replacing these components. We did pay that in the other buildings, and it didn't really matter because we were paying people to get it done fast. We wanted to get people back in there. Now it matters. We're choosing not to, and we think that what we're representing with this application is in fact market price for replacing those components, and we have data to back that up if you, again, want to go back through that. So with those changes, if you look at the submission on the front page of our submission for this application at this hearing, we're finding that these four buildings are ranging in value for for the estimated cost of damages and the estimated cost of improvements in the 24 to 27% of the value of the building. I would go on to say that, in my opinion, that also seems about right to me. You've got a building, these buildings are actually fairly resilient buildings. There is no basement. We got inundated up to about 24 inches. The foundations, the slabs, the walls, the brick, the roof, the windows are all fine. There's no damage to those. We lost contents, we lost water damage. We didn't even lose mechanical and electrical systems. You know, we didn't have all that stuff that was in the basement like in other buildings that would have gotten wiped out. They were fine. So when you look at the damages that occurred in this event, and you look at 25%, to me that seems about right from the standpoint of a gut sense, in addition to looking at all these numbers, and is what we believe is actually the realistic percentage and accurate percentage under the categories for FEMA for damages and improvements. And I think I'll stop there and then just respond to questions as they come up.
A couple of things that you just said. You said you're not putting back everything that was taken out. We're looking for a number to return to pre-flood condition. So
yeah, let me clarify.
Just clarify that, please.
We are putting back everything that was damaged. So you have two different categories. You've got damage to the building. All of that's going back in the way that it was to the condition that it was before the flood. But there are things, for instance, had we known that it was going to count, there's no reason that you have to go and replace the shower. Because the shower wasn't damaged in the flood. That was an improvement that the owner decided to make because they were in there anyway. We decided not to paint the ceilings. The ceilings weren't damaged by the flood. We decided not to put insulation in the bathroom walls and the party walls because there wasn't any insulation in there before. Those were improvements for soundproofing that cost money that we've decided to reduce that scope. So we did not reduce any of the damage scope of work, only the improvement scope. If that makes sense.
So when you said that kitchen cabinets, for example, had been removed and would not be replaced, upper cabinets. I would anticipate that upper cabinets, if they were there before, should be in the cost estimates now as replacement, because we're looking for value prior to the event.
Right. You're looking for the value of the flood damage as one number, and then the value of the improvements as a second number. So because the upper cabinets were not damaged by the flood, there's no reason that they don't fall into the category of something that has to be put back. There's certainly a case to be made that you could remove upper cabinets and feel like you don't want upper cabinets. In fact, we can bring furniture back in and provide furniture instead of upper cabinets if we need to. But because they're an improvement, they don't need to be counted as part of the cost of repairing damages. And as an improvement, again, it's at our discretion whether we put, what we do for those improvements. So again, that's in addition to the damages. So anything to do outside of damages is at the owner's discretion as to how they do it. Now, we obviously can't choose not to put a shower back in, so we're putting the showers in. The tubs have already been removed. We could have avoided that. We could have probably avoided the VCT tile that got ripped out because that wasn't really damaged by the water, but they decided to change that. So there are many things that are still in there that we're still doing. But the improvements, where we have discretion, we've removed some of those items. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, it did, perfectly. The, I'm sure that the board will have, and I have a lot more questions on the reconstruction or the restoration.
Sure.
But just for one moment, just talk a little bit about actual cash values. You have chosen a number of 30% for depreciation. What is the basis for the 30%? I mean, these are 40-year-old buildings, so why not fully depreciate them?
Well, the logic of that, I mean, my building, the house I live in was built in 1876. That would mean it really wouldn't have any value at this point. There's a point beyond which the depreciation isn't reflective of the actual value. So we talked to Everett Realty and said, how do we come up with this number? Are there standards for this? There are some standards out there, and it relates back to what's called, I think, the apparent age of the building. So if a building had never been taken care of, it would continue to depreciate. But if you go in and you're doing periodic maintenance, you fix the roofs, you paint it periodically, the buildings are in reasonably good shape, that depreciation stops and at some point becomes a point in time that is not fully depreciated. The 30% is a number that's higher. I did find a couple of references. There are some towns that have developed guidelines, so you don't have to make this up in a flood event, and they say, you can go in and they say, use this cost per square foot to build and this cost for depreciation. The numbers that I saw that had dictated this would have been in the 18 to 25% range. 30% is what the town assessor's office used for depreciation because they used a similar method. So we felt that if the town felt that 30% was the right number, that was a safe number to use. So essentially that's how we came up with it. We decided to use the same number that they had.
Linton, I have a few questions. And I pity the soul who is trying to reconcile what are occasionally inconsistent guidance from FEMA. But let me try.
Sure.
And see if we can't figure this out. I'm looking at a document called Answers to Questions About Substantially Damaged Buildings. It's been introduced into the record, and it's in a Q&A format. And on page 10 of the Q&A format, the FEMA guidance suggests that in answering, here's how it would answer the question: how should the market value of a structure be determined? For the purposes of determining substantial improvement, market value pertains only to the structure in question. It does not pertain to the land, landscaping, or detached accessory structures on the property. For determining substantial improvement, the value of the land must always be subtracted. Acceptable estimates of market value can be obtained from the following sources: independent appraisals by a professional appraiser, detailed estimates of the structure's actual cash value, paren, used as a substitute for market value based on the preference of the community, close paren, property appraisals used for tax assessment purposes, adjusted assessed value used as a screening tool, see question number 22, the value of the buildings taken from NFIP claims data used as a screening tool, and qualified estimates based on sound professional judgment made by staff of the local building department or local or state tax assessor's office. Is it, so it's your position that because these are listed in series and there's no obvious hierarchy, that the applicant has the ability to choose the method that would be most beneficial to the applicant?
It is our position.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would add to that, there's several guidance documents that we looked at. We had sent an email, I think Sue passed this on in your packet, speaking to actual cash value, where if you have that email, we quoted, I think, 3 different sources, all of which refer to actual cash value in one form or another as the cost of constructing a similar building at today's cost, less depreciation. One of the sources, the actual handbook that we most refer to, actually...
I'm sorry, that's this handbook?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
and that's also been introduced into evidence?
That handbook actually refers to a guide that's referred to as RS Means Unit Cost Guidebook for doing cost estimates. It is, that probably doesn't mean a whole lot to most people. It's something that we use. This is a copy of it, if you'd like to see it, for determining the cost of a building. And if you open the page to this, it'll say for a square foot of sheetrock, carry this for labor, this for material, this per square foot. So it is it is suggesting in that handbook that you can develop the actual cost data by going right through quantity takeoffs and unit prices, which is what we did. We hired a professional estimator who does that for a living as opposed to myself trying to do it out of this book. But to me, in reading that, it became very clear the intent, at least in that guidance, was that you could determine actual cost value by determining what it would cost to build that building today and then depreciating it. So that's what we based our time.
And if I could address a couple of things I wanted, because the discussion came up last time and because we have noted the FEMA guidance documents in several different formats, and that is that they are just that, guidance documents, informational purposes only. Your zoning regulation doesn't define market value, and I think the correct interpretation is that wherever it's uncertain or there's ambiguity or you must give the benefit of the doubt to the applicant. It's not that your zoning reg says you must go with what the applicant chooses. You have the discretion to use whatever method you would like. There is nothing in your zoning ordinance, even though it refers to the CFR, that CFR doesn't require you to use a certain methodology for either side of the numerator or denominator. So while these guidance documents may have been helpful in some cases, they're more confusing in others, and I think you can choose to ignore them completely. But again, I think both sides have reviewed them, and in some cases it's helpful, in some cases they're contradictory. FEMA, because it covers the country, has regional guidance that's different for the Midwest than it is for our region. So I think we must be given the benefit of the doubt as the applicant in any interpretation of your zoning regulations, and in this case, we think that both the estimate and the evaluations are reasonable and supported.
And I just want to make sure we have all of the proper documents that are referenced in your letter, Bob, entered into the evidence. So we do have the P758 substantial damage, substantial improvement desk reference. There might be another, the FEMA Region 7 guidance.
Right.
Is that appended to your application, or is it?
We have it here. It's in the
It's in the packet.
it's in the packet provided to us, which we'll enter into evidence, into the record.
There's also Unit 8 training guidance. Do you have that as well? You refer to? I have a single copy.
No, I'm sorry that you don't have that in the packet.
Yeah. If you could bring that up, that'd be good.
URL is listed at the bottom of that.
And a little more indulgence, Tim. I think the board, with these documents, will have most, if not all, of the documents that are helpful. The statute 42, well, no, I forget the code section. The U.S. code section doesn't define the term market value, uses the term in its definition of substantial damage and substantial improvement, but doesn't define the term. Nor does the Code of Federal Regulations, which then uses and adopts the term, doesn't define the term either. So to the extent that there are any definitions for the idea of market value, I guess that they are limited to the guidance from FEMA, and I'm pretty sure we're going to have most of, not all of it, entered into evidence.
There's a question. As you offer on the front page of your market value, $295,000, for instance, of Unit 159. Is that the replacement value minus the
30% depreciation.
the depreciation?
Yeah. If you went to Appendix A, we included the unit price estimates, which has the actual replacement value of those buildings. The first sheet in that is a summary sheet. And then we took 30% of those numbers and carried that in market value on the first page of our submittal. I'm sorry, we took 70% of those numbers, 30% discount for depreciation.
So what you're saying here is, offering here, is that it would, were we to try to replace those buildings as they were built, as well with the same materials, et cetera, it would cost $421,000.
That's correct. Yeah, now you get a sense of the scale of the value of those properties. Those, again, this cost estimator, this is the same estimator we used for the co-op building. The bids came in, you know, this is what he does for a living. These are the costs of building those buildings today to create similar value structures. And it does not include the site, and it doesn't include the design, which is not to be included in this. But were we to go out and create these 20 housing units some other way, you'd spend more than that. That does give you a sense of the magnitude of the value of these things. It is a value.
Unclear?
Tim, I have a question about the definition of the word violation. On the one hand, it seems that people are saying that a violation only exists if it's been identified. And if it hasn't been identified before the flood, fixing it cannot be exempted.
Correct.
However, if it was found, I have a little trouble with that definition in terms of, let's change it, and I go out to interstate and I drive at 100 miles an hour. Am I violating the speed limit, or since I wasn't caught, am I not violating the speed limit? It seems that whether you had been caught or not should be irrelevant to whether you're exempted or not. Anybody on either side?
There's a lot of information in the guidance there relating to that. Bob has his hand up.
Well, I just, to that point, I didn't go over, part of our submission was really a response to code and ordinance, and how do you determine whether that should be included or not. We've tried to refer to those guidance documents that we just submitted into evidence. You can read them for yourself, exactly the language with respect to code and ordinance. What we took away is that that would clearly be definitive. If you had a written violation ahead of time, then you'd know. You have to remember, too, that these guidance documents sometimes refer to just improvements. If the flood hadn't occurred and you were going into these properties and renovating them, you're trying to determine how you fit into these categories. They're written for that case as well. But it's our opinion that this really has to do with, and I think the Unit 8 training session speaks to this best, the reason that you're replacing something. So the example we gave is that if I'm replacing the faucet anyway, I've got to put a code-compliant faucet in there. That cost needs to be included because I was going to replace it anyway. But if the only reason that I have to replace it is because it's not in code, then that is excluded by the intent of this guidance document. And that's pretty clearly spelled out. You really have to read all three of them and you can come to that conclusion. And that's the conclusion that we came to. It really has to do with not if it's, again, when the violation needs to exist before the event, but not when it's found. It's the fact that, you're replacing it and you're only replacing it because it's a code violation. And we had several of those things. We did leave those items, we costed those items out separately and included them for each building in our submission. So if you choose to add them back in, those numbers are there. They are not in the
So on the 5th page of your summary, the cost of code improvements for the 4 buildings, that is not included in your total estimated costs.
That's correct. It is not in our estimated costs. You'd have to add those back in if you feel that they should be.
I mean, clearly there's a number of places within the documents that it makes the statement that, or there is a statement made that all buildings have violations.
Right.
All buildings have code violations because you can't, to be current code, you would have to build it currently.
Right.
So whether it be plumbing or electrical, whatever it is, at some point, when you do the repair work, you're going to catch it up.
And if you look
bring
at
it into compliance.
the training guidance, I call it training, Unit 8, whatever they call it, they talk a little bit about the intent of this, which is not to penalize people for health and safety code improvements that you have to make. They do make a distinction. If it's ADA improvements, that's not exempt. So it's only for health safety violations, building code violations, not for those other things.
Before we move on, has anybody on the board got any other questions at this point? I have a few questions about the building estimates, or the estimates in relation to repair or reconstruction.
Yeah, sure.
With building 230, you had profit and overhead at 10%. In the current set of documents, you've reduced it to 5%.
That's correct.
And the reason for doing that would be?
Profit is at 5% and overhead's at 5%, for a total of 10% between the two.
Correct.
Yeah, the reason is fairly simple. On the other properties, the other buildings, there was an allowance under the insurance, or at least an understanding, that one could get paid for 20% overhead and profit. I've never seen 20% overhead and profit in my career. It doesn't heard of. If you look at Tom Barden's estimate, he's carrying 10% for overhead and profit. It is an industry standard. We are submitting that, number one, that's not representative. Paying 20% overhead and profit is not representative of the market cost of repairing these components, first of all. So if we needed to go through the exercise, we would go back and remove all of that from the previous submittal, because what you're looking for is the market cost of replacing those components. And just like if we had volunteer labor, we'd have to carry a cost for that. We shouldn't have to carry the cost for, excess, emergency room rates for overhead and profit and overtime that you wouldn't normally do. These things are inflating the cost beyond the market cost of repairing that. So that's the first thing. We don't think that we're comparing apples and apples, number one. And number two, what we're required to do and what we're providing in this estimate for these 4 buildings is the market rate for overhead and profit, which is 10%. So in the last submission, it had been removed entirely. We'd added 5 and 5 back in, or 10% for this submission. So this does include overhead and profit. It does include supervision as well, because the $52 an hour is a blended rate between laborers, carpenters, and the supervisor. I mean, $52 an hour is pretty high for construction costs, even on average, quite frankly. So it's in there, but it's not 20%. And again, I would submit that. You can look at Tom Barden's estimate. I can leave you this book. You can look at industry standards for overhead profit across the country. You won't see 20% in there. You can talk to anybody in the construction industry. You don't see 20% for overhead profit. So that's why we're carrying 10%.
However, 20% was billed.
Yeah, insurance, so we'll give it to you. Insurance pays that.
It's not to say that you can't pay 20% if two parties want to. I'm not saying that.
Yeah.
And that's what was paid on the last set of buildings.
That's fine. I was asking you to speak to the fact that we've gone from 10% or 20% to 0% to 10%.
10%. That's correct. That's it.
And you know, the board has to make a decision as whether they feel 10% is the correct number at some
Sure.
point when we assess the numerator.
Yeah. If it would be helpful, we prepared a submittal that goes line by line through the building construction cost and identifies where the changes were and what those changes are. So it's only 10 items per building, but it itemizes everything that changed up and down to get to the numbers that you have before you. So we'd be happy to submit that and go through that if you want to go through those changes.
I have one other thing,
Sure.
one other line detail. I'm not sure, the board may wish. I have a question here. One of the things that we asked about at the previous meeting was the cost of demolition.
Yep.
And there is no submission in any of these buildings here that substantiates the cost of the cost of demolition. There is, however, a line item in there that covers the cost of demolition on a per building basis.
Right.
The line item, the labour charges that are in there for demolition are not at your $52 per hour. It's a reduced rate.
Right.
Can you speak to the reduced rate and the fact that there's no supporting documentation for that?
The labor rates are the only thing that, again, that you don't have a separate subcontractor because John Brunel is doing that with his own forces. So the labor rate for doing demolition is a laborer as opposed to the blended rate of superintendent and the rest of that. You just don't send the guys who do finished carpentry to do that, to hack out the walls. That's why it's a different rate. And I think that's the only one that is a different rate. There is, as you mentioned, selected demolition was not in the last set of numbers, and we've added it to that. And I don't know, I guess it does total up in the appendix that you have, because I'm looking at, it's $300 to $4,500 or $4,600, depending on which building, that's been added to those numbers. Yeah, right. It has the hour, yeah, so it is in there. You've got that in there.
So, just to clarify, the demolition work was conducted by John Burnell, the contractor, and that the number of hours spent in demolition in each building is recorded in here, and the rate is at 30 per hour rather than a 52.
The demolition work was actually conducted by Servpro, a separate contractor.
Okay.
John has the amount of hours that was spent doing that, and he used a billing rate appropriate for a laborer as opposed to a full crew rate, which we think is appropriate as well.
Yeah.
So that demolition cost, if you will, if you're sending somebody in to do demolition, that's what you would send your laborers to do, not the full crew, have them doing something else. So we think that's fair.
But in actuality, Servpro did the work.
In actuality, Servpro did the work, but
And they billed at $30 an hour?
I don't know what they bill at. And I don't know that you can pull those numbers
I
out.
put enough in there to cover demolition for the project. I didn't get Servpro's numbers.
One of the things that will be a requirement of this at the end of the day is that final invoicing and billing is supplied to the planning department for recording against those properties with regard to either substantial improvement or substantial damage should something happen in the future.
Right.
So the planning office, in terms of the record that is going to be kept for these properties, is going to expect to see the actual costs involved. I mean, one of the things we're dealing with here is estimates.
That's correct, yeah.
And, should something cost less or cost more, then the percentage figure for substantial damage is going to move.
Yeah.
And if something costs substantially more, then you may tip over the balance to over the 50%, and at that point, the building will have to be brought up to code.
So,
And that may occur, not if it doesn't occur now, it may occur in 6 months or 12 months or 2 years.
yeah.
So it's important that we've got here
You have
a lot of documentation relating to actual costs, to bids from, from suppliers, whether it be plumbers, electricians, and
Right,
suppliers of hardware or whatever.
right, yeah.
In the case of demolition, an estimate for 60 hours at $30 an hour, if in actual fact it was 40 hours at $90 an hour, the situation shifts.
It's, so first of all, let me say that we're happy to accept a condition that we would submit all the actual costs for this work, and we're confident that it's going to come in within these numbers. So we don't have any problem with that. We're fine with that. Again, our task was to come up with a cost for this that represented an estimated cost still, because all the work has not been done, for the damages and the improvements, of which included demolition. So we carried a number that we thought was more than enough for that. And if the actual cost turns out to be slightly different, we think we're still well within the percentages. As you can see, because we've gotten fixed price from subcontractors, there's only a couple of line items that are even variable at this point, which are essentially the labor for Brunel. I think there's 4 different line items in this entire estimate. The rest are subcontractors that have given us fixed costs, so or they're material suppliers that have given us fixed costs for the work at this point. So we've narrowed this down to a very small range of what could range. I didn't look at it, but these numbers could change substantially, and it still wouldn't affect the bottom line in any significant way, assuming you accept our market values, where they're at.
Just for my own clarification, maybe others, as we proceed, the terms market value and actual cost value and actual cash value are all the same.
No, well, let me see if I can clarify that. The market value is not really defined. There are several different guidance suggestions for how you can determine that. So we're saying actual cash or actual cost?
Cash.
Actual cash value, thank you, is one method of determining market value and the one that we would like to use. So that's what we've submitted on. Actually, on page 2, I think we gave you the other values. The appraised value is another acceptable method of determining market value, and that's on the table on page 2. The assessed value is another acceptable method. So we've shown all 3 of those values in our submission. Actual cash value, and I see I labeled that column wrong, it should be cash value, not cost, is the method that we would like to use for this solution. Does that clarify this? All methods of determining market value.
I think so, because I see that in a while we're going to be comparing the number you used called market value to a number used elsewhere, referred to, as I see, as the acronym ACV. Presumably, that's
actual cash value.
Actual cash value.
Right. So
we want to make sure that we're all in agreement. That's the right number, isn't it?
Right. That's what we're submitting as the market value of the building.
No, I have nothing. Dr. Chard? Catherine?
One of the things that we brought up in the last one was the volunteer labor. It was mentioned that that has to be put in as real dollars. And sorry, I don't know if that was in there or not.
Was there any volunteer labor in these structures?
There was some discussion last time about repair of the stoops, that there was no cost carried for that. That's been added in. So that was the only thing. Actually, repair of the stoops and the railings, which we did not have a number for last time, so those have been included in this.
But
there were no
outside of that, as in there has been in some of the other, Tri-Park, for example, had a lot of volunteer help.
None for us.
No, we had a lot of volunteer help getting residents moved and situated, but not on.
But not in
building-
terms of demolition or
not in terms of
construction or...
demolition or reconstruction.
Okay. Any other questions from the board? At this point, I'd like to ask the town if they have any submissions to make. Your opportunity to
Sure.
speak.
Yep. First of all, I'd like to apologize on behalf of Brian, who is not feeling well. So before you, you have a packet that was provided to you last week, and I'd like to have it entered into the record in entirety. I'm just going to take the time to list out what's included in that. It's consists of the memo dated December 1 from Sue Fillion. It consists of Appendix A from FEMA Region 7 guidance, produced in 1996. Consists of the proof of loss statements from the Brattleboro Housing Authority for the insurance that they have on the buildings. It consists of Section 4.4.8 of FEMA Guidance P75A, which is the otherwise known as the desk reference. It contains FEMA Guidance Section Unit 8, Corrections of Code Violations. It contains email from Mr. Stevens dated December the 2nd, addressed to our office. It contains a memo from Russell Rice, the Assistant Appraiser for the town. A letter from I.D. Francis, who is the Chief of the Floodplain Management and Insurance Unit for FEMA Region 1. And lastly, you received it tonight, a letter addressed to Mr. Cuthbertson from Rob Evans, the River Corridor and Floodplain Manager of Vermont River Management Program, Department of Environment and Conservation. So I want to make sure that each one of those items
Yes, I do.
is entered into record.
All those documents are duly entered into the record.
Okay. So I don't propose to take too much of your time in terms of our presentation or response to Brattleboro Housing Authority's submissions this evening. What I'd like to do is point you to the details of the memo prepared by Sue Fillion for you and the memo from Russ Rice to argue that the actual cash value appraisal offered by Brattleboro Housing Authority doesn't meet your requirements or our office's expectations. So we would request that you reject that. We don't have details from Mr. Barden as to whether he was retained by Mr. Stevens or whether he was retained by Brattleboro Housing Authority. We don't have a letter of engagement for him. We don't have a cover letter describing under what conditions you should use the estimates or the opinion that he provided to Mr. Stevens. And so therefore, it's difficult for us to review the methodology that underpins that. Moreover, moving on in terms of Brattleboro Housing Authority's submission tonight, they made an argument that concerning code violations, Sue Fillion is going to speak to the question of code violations in a moment, and our review of the same FEMA guidance leads us to different conclusions, and I would dispute that FEMA guidance encourages applicants to arrive at a setting or a set of documents that they prefer. And in fact, if you look at the same document that Mr. Stevens recommended you look at, or actually it was Mr. Miskovich, the answer to questions about substantially damaged buildings, FEMA 213, May 1991. Question 21, item 2. Question 21, item 2. Detailed estimates of the structure's actual cash value used as a substitute for market value. It's based on the preference of the community. So I would say that it's the board's, the DRB's decision as to whether to accept actual cash value or not. If you were going to choose that in preference to another judgment or another method for obtaining fair market value, you would need to be able to demonstrate in your decision in writing how this meets the requirements that Mr. Evans reminds you of, which are that it would be equitable, consistent, and defensible, not just in this decision, but any subsequent decision on substantial damage or substantial improvement while the code is in force. So you would need to be able to repeat the process. Moreover, the same guidance at the bottom of the same page, page 10, for structure, I'm quoting here, for structures that fall between the 40 and 60% range, all these structures do, more precise market value estimates should be used. So there's clear indications here from the same document on the same page that in fact the town's assessment or the market appraisal done by Mr. Everett for the previous hearing section of this hearing would be more legitimate. I also want to point out that in cases where the assessment level, this is from page 11, just above question 23, in cases where the assessment level is unacceptably low, or where the projected ratio of cost of repair to market value is close to 50%, and I think we've established that no matter what numbers we use, adjustments for assessment level must be made. If the use of assessed value is questioned, an appeal is warranted. We're in an appeal right now. But the burden of proof can be placed on the permit applicant, who can be required to submit an independent appraisal by a qualified appraiser, which they've already done. So what I'd say here is that it does not encourage the use of actual cash value in circumstances such as this. Moreover, as far as our office is concerned, when we've done the review of exactly the same documents, we have not found the broad encouragement that it's at the discretion of the applicant as to which methodology they employ. I would say that the onus and the obligation is on you as a board to determine precisely how you're going to process this with reference to Mr. Evans' requirements, that it be equitable and defensible.
In a never-ending search for more precision, do you have additional guidance? Do you have? You made a reference that in your office has.
We don't find the broad encouragement of the applicant to seek out which particular route gets them to the answer that they want. Okay.
That was question 23, was it?
Yep. Yep. And so, moving on to the actual cost estimates. The document is longer. The information is actually less detailed. There are still anomalies and inconsistencies. There's still unanswered questions. And lastly, despite the work needing to be estimated and carefully evaluated since August the 28th, most of the estimates and fixed cost information that is contained in the packet from Mr. Stevens is dated around Thanksgiving. So what I'd like to do now is just have Sue Fillion deal with the code enforcement question in particular, and then I'd be happy to have any of the three of us take your questions.
Could you just make your last point again? You're saying that documentation was done around Thanksgiving? I'm not
substantially after, so our concern would be that it doesn't reflect it's not chronologically, it's not consistent with the first estimate provided by Mr. Brunel or the second one, and it's a significantly different set of dates.
Okay, and Thanksgiving was when?
I had them all rebid.
Right.
Well, 1 second. Thanksgiving was when?
November 24th.
November 24th? Right. Thank you. Sue, please.
I just want to speak briefly to the code violation or the code improvements and the suggestion that they can be excluded. The FEMA desk reference P-758, that's the substantial improvement, substantial damage desk reference, which provides considerably more detail than Unit 8 does, is very clear that in order to exclude this work, it needs to be to correct an existing cited violation identified by local code enforcement officials, and required to correct the existing violation. And it specifically draws a distinction between a violation and elements that don't meet the present-day design or building code standards. I spoke with Pete Lynch, who does annual, he's the assistant fire chief. He does annual life safety inspections for all Brattleboro Housing Authority's properties, and they had no violations on record. He said occasionally when they do inspect commercial buildings, they do find some issues that they will have people correct right away, but there are no existing violations at VHA, nor were they cited by the state for any violations. And I would like to suggest that...
Can I just hold you a minute? So, Peter Lynch of the Brattleboro Fire Department has stated that there are no code violations written up for the Brattleboro Housing Authority.
For the Melrose Terrace.
For the Melrose Terrace.
Yeah. Okay. And he inspects it based on...
These specific buildings, or just none, full stop? No code violations at all?
We spoke about Melrose Terrace.
No, but we're considering four structures or four buildings.
All Melrose Terrace?
I can't recall.
You can't recall,
what the
okay.
conversation was.
But certainly in the case of these four, there were no code violations.
Right.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, so you were referring to some part of this?
Yes.
Which part was it?
It is section 4.4.8.
Okay.
So changes to the plumbings, to the fittings, I'm not really sure what the code issues that they identified were there. It could have been the fact the state had a lead law that went into effect in 2010. Again, they were grandfathered. They were not in a position to be condemned just because they were not up to code. So we view those code improvements as counting towards substantial improvements, substantial damage.
1 second.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Scott.
Well, actually, kind of a point of order. Are there any people in here having trouble hearing everybody speak?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Everybody. It's hard to hear in this room. The acoustics are really poor. And this, of course, is not just a hearing between the board and the applicants. So if everybody would please try to get up to the top of your voice if you have to. Thank you.
Do you want to turn off the heater behind you?
I tried. It didn't seem to work. Maybe I don't remember how to do it.
Can we call Honeywell? Sue, please continue.
I'm done.
You're done. Thank you. Bob, do you have any...
I just wanted to make reference to Russell Rice's submission too. And what we're really asking the board to do is to be fair and consistent with respect to both how it arrives at the numerator and the denominator with respect to this decision as to substantial damage. For the reasons outlined in Russell Rice's memo, the actual cash value approach is discounted greatly. But I want to point out, Mr. Stevens, number one, is not a certified appraiser and is employing neither is Mr. Barden, the professional estimator, and yet they're trying to say the value of these buildings are double what the town's assessment was. The town assessment being a townwide reappraisal very recently, which as far as using it as a screening tool, I can understand why FEMA says use it as a screening tool, because in many situations you have an assessed value that may be grossly less than what a fair market value is. Take into consideration the fact that the town did a townwide reappraisal in 2010, and for these other properties, really 2011. Secondly, when you come up with the ACV, the same document that Mr. Stevens quotes indicates that you look to the proof of loss forms which were submitted as part of this packet for each of the buildings. you don't necessarily pick your own estimator, because all of these things are to some extent a screening tool as to how you're coming up with market value. This nebulous notion of what the property is worth. And we have a lot of guidance, and we have 5 or 6 different suggestions as how to get there. But if you look at the proof of loss statements for the various buildings, and this is on page 1 of Sue's submittal, the values that were actually listed for the actual cash value of the structures for building 159 is 166, 636, building 165 essentially 250,000, building 246, 272, etc. You can see that. But what I would ask you to take a further look at is to compare those to the Everett real estate appraisal, wherein you will find, for instance, on building 159, I believe the value was roughly 175,353. That's much closer to the 166, which is the housing authority's own submission to its insurance. And I frankly don't understand why you would have certain factual statements and claims made to an insurance company and others to a development review board. The conclusion is you're looking at, in this case, trying to get under a 50%. But try to be consistent with regard to the numbers. So my point is that if you take the Everett appraisals, they're much closer to the ACV from the National Flood Insurance Program proof of loss statements, which were submitted by the Brattleboro Housing Board. Furthermore, if you take the per unit cost based on Mr. Stevens' actual cash value approach, you're looking at values per unit which are between $66,000 per unit and $100,000 per unit. Compare that again to the Everett appraisal, which was roughly around $47,000 per unit, and the town, which was
39. 39,544.
Thank you. Again, the actual cash value roughly double what the town is and substantially higher than Mr. Evans. So when you look at that, in the effort to be consistent in applying these fair market values and how you arrive at that, we would urge the board to discount the actual cash value and look far more to the Everett appraisal and or the town's appraisal, which was done contemporaneously shortly before the flood.
Is it the town's position that the actual cash value from the NFIP statements should also be disregarded?
It is less accurate in our view than a certified appraisal. And Russell Rice, in his testimony at the last time we were before the board, did not find any fault. Russell Rice being an appraiser himself, but not testifying with regard to his professional license. But he testified as to how the town came up with its value, but he also did not, in his prior testimony and in his memo that is submitted tonight, in any way challenge the methodology that Mr. Everett's firm used. So with respect to that, I would suggest that the town's appraisal and the Everett appraisal hold far more weight than the actual cash value submitted by the Brattleboro Housing Authority, especially when their estimates don't comport with the direction that the FEMA Region 7 or whatever it is recommends using from the NFIP proof of loss statements.
Thank you.
Is the town able to tell us why they believe the estimator's actual cash value was so high in comparison to the other state?
No, we don't have enough background information on how those figures were developed.
Pleasure. Anything further? Teresa? Yeah.
Do some more rebuttals.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Well, I'd like to open up to the public before we, then we'll allow you to rebut any testimony that's, so please note, make notes. And, just before I do that, any further questions from the board? At this point, I'd like to open it up to the public. If there's any member of the public who wish to speak to this application, please come up. Oh.
Janet Kramer from Brattleboro. I'm a housing commissioner, but I'm speaking definitely as a layperson. I've heard a limitation from Mr. Cuthbertson as to the areas to be covered by my remarks. So I will take a leaf from our town attorney for fair and equitable, and really ask how the board makes different choices. And I'm using a picture from today's Reformer studio on the Mend, showing the Whetstone studio, which is on a berm, showing the very substantial damage of this building from the Whetstone Brook. The board discussed this application on the 7th of November when we presented our request to be able to restore the buildings that we believe are not substantially damaged. And the board agreed, the work is being done. And yet we are continuing to delay, continuing to hear controversy as to how to evaluate these buildings, rather than can we as a town work together to make this work. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other member of the public? Byron? No? There being no further questions at this point.
Want to start with yours? Go ahead.
Please, yeah.
Just as a point of clarification, the actual cash value shown on the insurance company proof of loss forms were not developed by the Brattleboro Housing Authority. They were on the forms that came to us from the claims adjuster, and we didn't sign these forms. So those are not our...
So those values would...
Those are not our numbers.
They would
that's
derive
all
from
I'm
the
saying.
insurance... 1 second. They were forthcoming from the insurance company?
Yeah.
Tim?
Yes.
We have FEMA officials in the audience that could help me with this, but my understanding is that Brattleboro Housing Authority had 60 days to file a proof of loss statement. 60 days has expired since the incident and the claim was made. And we were, of course, curious as to why these proof of loss statements remained unsigned. And so we're asking that if there actually has been proof of loss statements that have been reviewed by Brattleboro Housing Authority as the property owner and signed as the insured, which they're required to do within 60 days, that the board should be provided with copies of that, as should our office.
I think you just said that they were signed.
No, these were not. These were not signed. We contracted with claims adjusters who provided, because the amounts of damage that were on these were low. So we contracted with claims adjusters who provided proofs of loss, and the relevant numbers on those were the net amounts claimed under the property. And those are the forms that we signed, and they actually showed zeros in the actual cash value because it wasn't really relevant to the claim.
I should also point out that when we sought these documents, we were expecting signed proof of loss statements that would meet the requirements of the insurance policy that Brattleboro Housing Authority has.
Sure.
I had a question for the town. We got into the issue of violations and the need for improvements. Does the town have an estimate of the proper cost or an adjusted cost for the items that Stevens does not account for?
On violations?
Yeah.
Well, he had suggested they had suggested the fire-rated sheetrock and the plumbing, which have been separated out in their tables, so
That is in here.
we think they should be included.
Total of them is summarized in the report.
It's summarized in the
and it's
report.
in
Right.
Each individual building estimate. It's broken out.
So that's the only thing that the town believes should be added to the cost of improvement? Is that right?
Well, I think through Rod's testimony, we have concerns with the rest of what we call estimates number 3.
Okay, is
The
there,
ones that were handed in here, but I guess in terms of what we could find, for sure, we believe that the code upgrades should be included towards the cost of damage/improvement.
Were there any other points, aside from the ACV on the...
Yeah.
ACV on the proof of loss forms?
Yeah, I'd like to
Well,
walk
please,
through.
yeah, please go through.
I'm going to start in reverse order because that's how best I remember. I guess you now have Region 7 guidance, determination of cost. And if you go to page 304, under value determination, I want to point out the paragraph that's being referred to where it says we should be using the actual cash value from the flood insurance proof of loss statement. So the paragraph leading into that says any of the following sources should provide satisfactory estimates for market value. It says that it should provide satisfactory estimates. It doesn't say that you should use those or you must use those. In fact, in the same document, if you back up to page 2, there's a paragraph that defines what the actual cash value as the cost of building a similar building at today's cost, i.e. replacement cost. So while we're not claiming that we know, nor am I going to dispute what Russell Rice has to say about the market value and his business of coming up with market value, certainly know how to come up with the cost of building a building. That's my business. That's why it refers to this MS, RS means cost data. That's what we do. So the actual cash value, and again, I won't reiterate it. If you look at my email, all 3 of the guidance documents we talk about refer to the cost of building this building in today's dollars. And I've quoted those. One of the references, this is a guidance document. It's very consistent with what we submitted for how we calculated the cost of the building. If they want to debate what the depreciation should be, that I think is a judgment call for an appraiser. Again, I used what Russell used last time. I wasn't privy to the 3-page letter until a few minutes ago, so I wasn't able to go through this in detail. But unless he disputes that we should be using a 30% depreciation, we maintain that the actual cash value is calculated correctly, and that this is in fact the market value for a building that then favorably compares to the cost of replacing this. And again, the reason that Region 7 is pointed out, it is a document, and again, it's not our region, but it's a guidance document for another region. This is a national program, so it's indicative of the standard of care for this kind of thing in the country, and this is a countrywide program. This document actually says that this is really the only meaningful way to come up with a market value that compares to replacement cost when you're adding up cost to build something. I got news for you. If you work on your house and you spend $60,000 on it, it ain't worth $60,000 when you're done building it. If you go to the tax assessor or an appraiser, he's going to take 80% of that. So you're comparing something that is apples and oranges. We're saying this is now apples and apples. If that makes sense.
I'm sorry, Bob. Your comments pointed out something that I had missed before. We're not in Region 7?
We're not in Region 7.
We are in Region 1.
Yeah. So this
Does Region 1 have guidance?
No, we
Is the Region 7 guidance applicable in Region 1?
Yes.
Oh, we haven't seen that.
Why is Region 7 guidance applicable in Region 1?
Because it's a national program and the rules and requirements are...
Yeah, but if it's a regional guidance, then it applies in the region. Otherwise, you could have Region 7 and Region 1 having inconsistent guidance, and then that guidance would be an applicant would be incapable of complying with both guidances at the same time.
I'm gonna answer that question very briefly, and then actually ask that you recognize Cheryl Waltz from FEMA, who can provide more detail and answer. But what I'd say is that in our work, it's customary with a range of federal government agencies, FEMA, HUD, the EPA, for different regions to produce guidelines on various aspects of the Code of Federal Regulations for implementation and guidance purposes. And that they are in response to questions or issues that arise within those regions. They're provided available through the web as public documents. They're vetted and reviewed by federal agency staff so that they're obviously not in conflict with the CFR. And it doesn't mean what you're implying, which is that it only works in Region 7 and therefore not in Region 1, or it only works in Region 1 and therefore not in Region 7. But I'll let Cheryl answer that question in more detail, because I think she can shed some light on it. But we frequently work with interpretations of the federal regulations from a variety of different sources. That's what I'd say.
The board recognises Cheryl.
Cheryl Walls, FEMA. Region 7 provided some guidance on this particular disaster because in training with the substantial damage software to the communities, it was Region 7 personnel that came out and put on those workshops. And that is why Region 7 guidance came to Region 1. And it's a national guidance. It is used in all regions. It just has Region 7 on it because they were the actual trainers that came to the communities and to the state with this training at this point in time.
Is there Region 1 guidance that's different, or?
Not at this time.
Not at this time.
And it would not be different.
Right.
The guidance comes from headquarters, it comes from the CFR, it comes from the Stafford Act. All of our guidance come from our doctrines, and they are compiled. When they say it's a regional, it means they may have taken certain things that are applicable in a given point in time with this situation, meaning this particular disaster. There may be something different across the state line that may be, more pertinent to this information, and it may have been included. It doesn't mean it's excluded from the guidance. It means that in the training for how these communities are looking at going through and assessing the initial damage, this is what we're using as a training tool, because we could be sitting there with an 80-page document, and that's just too much for a community to digest and use.
And I know you didn't write this, so I don't fault you for it, but what is, do you know what it means when it says this regional guidance is provided for informational purposes only? I mean,
it is a guidance. It is not a legal document. It is used when we go out to the communities, especially because they may or may not have ever used this information before, especially on a large-scale event. And so when we provide them with information, we want to say that there may be additional information that may be pertinent to their particular circumstances that may be here in Brattleboro but may not be up in Burlington. There is additional information. It is a short blurb of the guidance. Our guidance is brought out to the community to work with them to set in the beginning, okay, you have the potential of maybe 2, maybe 200, maybe 2,000 structures that were damaged during this event. That's a lot to handle at one time. And so the guidance is, what are you going to use to come up with these costs? Once that is set, then that is pretty much the guidance that is looked at to continue throughout this event and through the maintaining of your ordinance until something else is changed within your ordinance. So whatever was said at the beginning by this zoning board is what we recommend that you continue to use, not only in this hearing, but as well as the previous hearing, because it not only affects the individual sitting at the table over here, It affects every other individual in the community that had an estimation done by the zoning board on their property.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So we could continue?
Please do, Bob.
Okay.
Yep.
Code violations. I think that this is a little bit confusing, and if you look at any of the three guidance documents, you might come away with a slightly different interpretation. In our submittal, in our letter, we tried to outline our arguments as clearly as we could. We went back to what is actually written. And if you look at what is written, it's very clear that the violation must exist before the event or the application. Nothing in that, and in most of the guidance documents, nothing says that you have to have it. It has to be cited before the event. So that's the distinction I'd like to clarify. And with that in mind, have you go through and read these source documents and see what you come up with. When I read through them, and actually on page 8-26 of the Unit 8 section, there's a very good write-up in that talks about the exemption was intended for involuntary improvements. It says nothing about having to be cited before the event, so as long as it's identified as something that existed prior to the event and proven that it is a code violation, it qualifies, and it has to be a health and safety issue, and it has to be something that is an involuntary improvement, as we said before. Those are the criteria. That's the purpose, the intent. You can read the handbook, so to speak. They title something correcting existing cited violations, but nothing in the language says that the citing has to be before the flood. So again, if I just suggest you read through that and come to your own conclusions. We put our arguments in writing, to me, it is a little bit muddled, but it's very clear if you read it, and it helps to understand what the intent is. And we're not doing these things because we want to do them. Either they're not flood damage and they're not substantial improvements. We're only doing them because we have to meet code for health and safety. So we think that meets the definition, and that's why we've broken them out. And I have a little trouble going back further because there was a lot of sort of comments about, the details regarding engagement from Tom Barr. I don't know why you need to know what our engagement letter is from Tom. We're submitting, as a professional engineer, that we hired a professional cost estimator to prepare an estimate. You can see what he used to do that. If the town wants to take that estimate and send it to another cost estimate, we welcome them to do that to get their own professional opinion. But I don't know why we need to. In fact, I don't have an engagement letter. I said, Tom, I need an estimate. Here's the plans. That's what he does for us. Does it all the time. I guess I feel that stands on its own, and I don't know why that should be excluded or not considered as expert testimony from the source that's here. And likewise, again, you've got an estimate from John Brunel, the guy who's actually doing it, backed up by numerous other tradespeople, by suppliers, and reviewed by our office, which does this for a living as well. So again, I think that testimony, I'm not quite sure why that's being challenged if it is. I'm not actually sure I followed that. Yeah, and as to Mr. Evans' letter, I'm sorry, I haven't really had a chance to go through his comments on actual cash value. I would say I'm starting to take a little issue, though, with this, reference back to, well, if you don't do this exactly right, you're going to lose your FEMA certification, or you're not following these guidelines, and there's somebody looking over your shoulder to say that all hell's going to break loose. A couple of things about that. Number one, we've shown you several guidance documents. There's obviously variation in discretion that's left to you to make some decisions here. Second of all, there's a variance procedure. The rules say that even if we don't comply, we could come back to you within your discretion and say, this is a hardship. We did substantial improvements because of ignorance working with the town up front. We might very well do that if you decide against this. You have the discretion without risk of violating the entire FEMA process, based, at least I believe you do, based on that evidence, to say that you can interpret this without fear of the federal government coming down and telling you that you're doing something wrong. This is your program, and it looks to me like there's plenty of discretion in here to interpret this based on the information you have. And finally, again, there was a comment made about our cost estimate being dated after Thanksgiving or around Thanksgiving. That is true. and it was done around Thanksgiving. In fact, John and I were there the day after Thanksgiving, editing and reviewing this, because he went back. The previous estimates were done. They weren't as accurate. They didn't have backup. We went back and re-estimated this project. Not sure why that's a problem. That's what we did. You asked for consistency and clarification, so we put more effort into this to come up with more accurate numbers, and numbers that, quite frankly, we can go through line by line and defend where it is, bring them into the buildings and measure the quantities. We're very confident that these are accurate and exact. So that's true. Those were done after the last hearing. That's what we've been working on for the last 4 weeks. And finally, and again, I might refer back to Pat, yeah, we didn't, there is nothing in the FEMA guidance that says that ambiguity goes to the applicant. I think that Pat was referring to, I'll let you respond to that.
Sorry, Vermont law, case law, environmental court law is very clear that if there's ambiguity, uncertainty, if there's a benefit of the doubt to be given, that goes to the applicant. Also wanted to address a couple of statements. One that that the estimate provided doesn't meet your requirements. I don't believe I'm misquoting, and is not equitable or defensible. Again, your requirements under the zoning regulation are to assess what the market value is and the estimates. You don't have anything other than what we have provided you in terms of all of us, in terms of guidance documents to come up with those. And I think what we are presenting is that all of those, the appraisal, the town's assessment, actual cash value, are legitimate means of coming up with market value and within your discretion. And that all of them, including what we have presented, are defensible and are equitable, and the decision is yours in relation to those. And we think that the local contractor who did the other 11 buildings has provided estimates that are reasonable, and we think the values provided to you by Mr. Stevens are reasonable and equitable, and prove that these buildings have not been substantially damaged. And I'll end as I began several weeks ago, that it is about the numbers. And in looking at all of the estimates, all of the values, the NFIP, adding in the code work, the totals of all of those, and you can do the math or I can provide it, no matter which method we use, they all are falling under 47.5%, no matter what. Adding in all of the code violations, whether we use the NFIP, the only value I am not looking at is the town's assessment. But if it's based on the appraisal, we are under 50%. If it's based on actual cost estimate, it is under 30%. If we use the NFIP, it's under 47% on all of these buildings. So we are well within the range and well within the discretion that you can give. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Fisher.
Just briefly, because there's been so much on market value, and there doesn't seem to be the definition in our zoning ordinance. But in Vermont statutes, which is Title 32, 3481, the fair market value is the value of a property, is the price which the property will bring in the market when offered for sale and purchased by another, taking into consideration all the elements of the availability of the property, its use, both potential and prospective, functional deficiencies, and all other elements such as age, condition, which combine to give the property a market value. So I would suggest, number one, that with all of our guidance, that if you determine that that guidance is insufficient, look to our own statutes for that answer. Secondly, with respect to the code enforcement, even if we had a building inspector whose job was to go out and to cite buildings for violations, in this situation, given that these properties were pre-existing or grandfathered, unless these properties were either damaged as they were in the flood, or the housing authority decided, well, we're going to renovate building number 165 or something. Would you actually have occasion for an inspector to go in to identify any such violations? So I think it's a bit of a red herring with respect to trying to exclude those, because number one, they weren't identified because we don't have such a system of identifying them. And number two, even if we did have such a system, those would not be identified prior to the event, which caused the damage, which caused people to come in and look at that. And lastly, I would disagree with Attorney Bew insofar as when you look at all of the values compared to the cost estimates, do they come under 50%? If you look at the appraisal done by Dart Everett, and if you took the cost by Mr. Brunel, the second set, and you added in the overhead and profit, which they acknowledge should be added in, that comes to well over 50%. Any of the values using the town's appraisal, they come in at over 50%. It's only this third set, and if you first don't succeed, try again, seems to be the avenue of approach here. But only with the third set is what Attorney Bew's statement holds true.
Thank you. Rod.
I'd like to pick up on a couple of points. I want to underline the argument made by Mr. Fisher regarding state statute and market value. I also want to pick up on the suggestion that when there is ambiguity, the benefit of the doubt is offered to the applicant. The appellants here have establishing or attempting to establish an argument that there is ambiguity in the guidelines because there are choices offered from the FEMA guidance as to which kinds of information the Development Review Board can decide they will use for an initial assessment and then a final decision. And so in my earlier presentation this evening, I underscored the point made by Mr. Evans, and I'll repeat it again, that the obligation is actually on you as a board to arrive at a decision that you can defend, that shows that you're being equitable and fair, and that it's defensible, and that you can repeat the process for all other applicants. Now, it is our view that the actual cash value estimate offered by Mr. Stevens on behalf of Brattleboro Housing Authority tonight, insofar as we understand it, and we're missing some vital background information on how it was arrived at, doesn't meet our expectations that would allow you to use that as a source of information to establish, in this instance, what the numerator is. We have also contended that there are many inconsistencies and shortcomings that we've identified in the cost estimates so far. We've not dwelt on those at any great length. I'm still happy to go through the list if the board is interested in reviewing those. I think we've made clear here that the cost of code compliance should be included, and I think that we've been able to support each one of our arguments in the FEMA guidance easily. The obligation that you have, one more time, is that you need to figure out which items you're going to select for making this decision. And the reason why the guidance is simply that is that they do leave the discretion to you as the local code enforcement board to establish that. What I would say is that where you differ from the guidance that's been offered, or where you utilize something that is explained in terms of if it's the only thing available, or if there is other, extenuating circumstances, something such as an actual cash value might substitute for instance, inaccurate town assessments, or the inability to get a market appraisal done effectively. You don't have that problem. You have an accurate town assessment, and you have a well-documented appraisal at your disposal. So you don't have to choose the actual cash value estimate that's been offered this evening. But you do have to decide whether you are or whether you're not going to take it. When it comes to the cost estimates, like I said, there are absences and gaps and inconsistencies that we feel undermine its authority, despite the repeated insistence on the part of Mr. Stevens that it's accurate. And so if you've got further questions at the
I think
point-
the applicant is offered to go through this line by line. I think that'd be a good exercise. I'd like to hear the town's position on each of these lines. I mean, if we're going to be within a couple percent, and there are absences and gaps, let's talk about the absences and gaps.
Well, I would actually offer that I don't think we're in a situation here to horse trade on the percentages.
I'm
or
not
the
horse trading,
estimates.
I'm just trying to get accurate information.
If I could just finish. So, I'm not sure that that's the most appropriate route for tonight in terms of.
I'll ask the chair, is that an appropriate route for tonight?
It may be. Let him finish, and then we'll look at it.
So, what I'd say is that the kinds of things that we've identified might not be so easily resolved as, you know, a line-by-line item. So, let me start. In the descriptions of the scope of work,
Just let me hold you 1 second. Is this, you have a long list?
Not particular.
What's your list?
Not particular.
Okay. Because we have one or two members of the public that have raised their hands a couple of times,
okay.
and maybe before we get into the detail, I would just like to give them an opportunity to speak. Just hold the thought. Byron, you had your hand up. Thank you.
Byron Stuckey. I've listened for a lot of hours on 2 nights, and with all due respect to town staff, I have to ask, why are we trying so hard to not approve this application?
Thank you. Were there any other, somebody else had indicated a, no? Well, while we have the subject, I want to just take a moment. Was it Janet? You asked about a building downtown that was, where work was being undertaken? It was it? Let me just, I'll give you a very quick
Janet
answer.
Quick.
So
Yes.
we're not leaving you hanging with that question. That building conforms to current flood hazard standards. So there is no issue of conformity with that building. It conformed before the flood, it conforms now in its application. So it's a commercial building where the elevation of the ground floor is 1 foot above base elevation, 1 foot above base flood elevation, and as such, he was permitted to move forward with his permits. It was a conforming structure.
Thank you for clarifying it. However,
All right.
I've got to say, as a layperson in the community, I've had several people comment to me that they cannot understand why that building was being worked on right now while Melrose is held up in this kind of interregnum.
Yep. Had it not been conforming, they would not be working on it. Or they would be being asked to bring it into code conformance with flood proofing or flood hazard measures. Anyway, that's just to answer your question so you have some understanding. Yes,
Can I respond here?
Yeah.
I understand what you're saying. The problem we have is the forum. You're quite right in asking, why are we here? And in a way, we aren't supposed to talk. That's not it's not part of our job. We're here because the town has fears of consequences. Now, those fears of consequences are not supposed to be a part of what we are deciding here. But of course, that is in fact what's on everybody's mind. What are the risks if we do this or we do that? With whom can we negotiate? What's all the histories in other towns and other places? What's happened? How has FEMA reacted in the past? There's a whole lot of information that's relevant to everything that people are thinking, but which isn't directly relevant to the only thing that we here can decide, and that is whether there was substantial damage or not. But there is so much more, and for that, at some other time, if and when it arises, the citizens of this town must re-engage the town for that discussion and really hear from the town what its problems and what its issues are.
Thank you, Spring. Rod, you had...
I had identified some issues. I guess my concern would be, I think Bob mentioned at the beginning that he had a more detailed document that was line by line. It's different from what we were provided with. Is that right? You said at the beginning?
We haven't submitted that. We have a line-by-line outline of the changes from the previous submittal to this one, and we'd be happy to submit that and go through that if that's what people would like to do. So if there's questions about the estimate, maybe that's the best way to go through this.
If I could, yeah, okay.
Do you have that document with you, or...?
Right here, 10 copies.
The problem I have with that is that there's an extensive amount of information that we've reviewed as a board. I mean, tremendous amount, hours and hours and hours of work. And to introduce a new document at this point for review at 9:15, I mean, we have some options. We could continue the hearing to a later date. You could introduce the evidence. We could review it.
I would only suggest, I mean, Rod's uncomfortable. He's obviously got some questions about whether this covered everything or whether the changes make sense. Perhaps what we should do is submit it and take the first page, there's 10 items, quickly sort of paraphrase it. There's one page per building, so there's only 4 pages in the packet, and then you can take it, and the town can take it, and you can review it at your leisure. Does that make sense? Take me 3 minutes to go through it, I think.
Do you have multiple copies?
Yeah, I've got enough for everybody here and the town staff.
Rod, could you advise us when you see this document if there's anything else that you have on your list where you have concerns that isn't included there?
Yep. All right.
These are the line-by-line changes from the previous submitted cost. And you'll see on the left side, and the first building is building 159, so there are 4 buildings, 4 pages. On the left, under the phase, this correlates with the cost estimate that we've submitted: demolition, insulation, drywall taping, doors, trim, and so on. So the previous cost is listed in one column. The revised cost, as you can see for demolition, we added $3,680 and reduced the previous cost. I'm sorry, the previous cost had some demolition. We added, the revised cost is $3,680, so the difference is an additional $3,000. So these are the changes line by line. Again, you can see insulation came out, which was sound insulation, was not an as-was. There was some reduction in drywall and taping. Trim and materials came down quite a bit. This is because there were allowances in them the last time, and we sent out bid packets and got actual costs. Door and trim labor is the same. We did not change the labor cost from the previous estimate to this one. Cabinet, the only thing that came out on the cabinets was the upper cabinets. Painting, again, I think we mentioned this in our submittal. We did change the painting scope. We didn't do ceilings. We changed to prime plus 1. We bought pre-primed materials. That cut that cost down quite a bit, and so on. For the most part, and again, just to point out, to clear up, we did carry overhead and profit. We added 10% in. So the overhead and profit is in these numbers. That's an additional $6,000. And you can see the net change on the bottom was a minus $15,000 with those changes. 4 other buildings, similar kind of examples. There's some variation. Some buildings had upper cabinets still in them. Therefore, the fire coating didn't need to get done. Some of the fire coating that we had in the previous estimates were actually brick walls, so they didn't need to be fire coated, so that scope got changed. And there were some quantity changes where we measure a little more accurately with sort of minor stuff. But that, in essence, is the change from before till now. I don't know. Again, Rod's just seeing it for the first time. I don't know if that gives him comfort in where the changes came from, but again, we can do that in more detail.
So in the case of each structure or each building, you've basically tightened the costs up
Yeah.
where you can, and there's a reduction between 13,000 and 15,000, 23,000,
23,000.
34,000
That's right.
in 165.
And the comments under each one of those categories tells you where those changes came from, and the dollar amount is there line by line.
Tim, are you ready to hear from us?
Oh, yes, certainly.
First off, I would object to the board hearing this without the opportunity of the town to research this and verify this. Because, for instance, when you take things like the amount of insulation that they have taken out, we've got numbers here which show, let's say, a reduction. We have no way to verify, especially tonight when we've been handed this for the first time, where that insulation was taken out, how much. We don't have Mr. Brunel's previous ones showing exactly the measurements and the amounts of insulation that he had proposed with respect to that. We're to take this on their face value without checking.
But you had the underlying information a couple weeks ago, correct? And this is just a comparison of one spreadsheet to another spreadsheet. So you would have been able to come up with these columns, maybe not the narrative, but the columns.
With regard to that, the difficulty is, for instance, when you're looking at things like drywall, you've got certain estimates, and then you go back to some of the previous estimates, there were certain estimates that were done for small patches, which had a higher amount, other estimates that had a larger square footage, where it was a lower one. My point is that you can't, apples to apples, determine the differences, nor can the town, looking at it in the course of a couple of minutes here, verify or double-check the amounts that they're saying. So that when they say they remeasured, we should be able to re-verify those measurements based on previous estimates that were given and these.
Yes, sir.
So yeah, my reluctance to participate in this process is precisely to do with the point that Bob just made, which is there are many items, in FEMA guidance that establishes whether there's a, what constitutes damage, what constitutes improvement, how it should be accounted for, down to and including things such as appliances. And so when we're given something like this, which influences quantities of material and quantities of labor, and make, in some instances, significant adjustments, then I think for the purposes of providing you as the board appropriate guidance through the function of the planning office, what we need to do is to ensure that these adjustments conform to the guidance that we have, and that's time consuming. I would want to make that statement.
But I'm sorry, but you haven't provided any of that guidance yet. This is the second hearing. This was warned initially 6 weeks ago, and you haven't provided us any guidance from building professionals, either on the first application or the second application. I know that this has just been handed to you, but the applicant did that reluctantly.
Well, I don't want to comment on the emotional standing of the appellant right now, but what I would say is that we have identified...
Sorry, what does that mean?
Reluctant. I don't know if they're reluctant or not. So what I would say is that we have found some inconsistencies in the estimate that was provided in this document, as we did in the initial document. And we spent a considerable period of time with Mr. Brunel working through his his second estimate. That constituted a large part of the last time we were hearing this case. So what I'm offering to you is that we see some continued problems here, and there's ways in which this cost estimate has been developed which makes it difficult for us to offer that guidance. And I'd actually like to quote Mr. Stevens on this. This is from page 3 3 of 5 of his letter, unfortunately, obtaining additional competitive bids for this work is not possible without development of plans and specifications. Furthermore, as some portions of the work has been completed, a fair and equitable bidding process is difficult at this stage. This is in the last, third page of a 5-page document, where Mr. Stevens qualifies the work that he's done quite carefully to avoid any commitment to the actual figures. So if you refer to the paragraph just above that, he goes into an explanation about the circumstances that they confronted at the time as to why the estimates might not be as accurate as you might hope for. So what I'd say is that we're dealing with the circumstances that the applicant is in this instance, which is some of the work has been done, some of the estimating has been done quite close to the time of the event, some estimates and quantity estimates have been provided sometime afterwards, and that there has been now 3 revisions to the scope of the work.
But what's wrong with this one? Let's talk about that. What's wrong here?
Let me give you some examples.
Great.
But all I'm saying is that they're illustrative. What I would say, and what I was saying before, is that the purpose of our, the key point of our presentation is that the board needs to arrive at a process that you're comfortable with and that you can continue to apply. And I think that that's the first issue that needs to be resolved, where, and that would be the substance of our memo and the substance of our recommendations to you. And so, in terms of whether to use ACV or not,
no, that's the denominator.
Talk about the numerator.
We're on the top.
Yes, I know.
We're talking about the numerator.
Let me just finish. What I'd say is that those decisions are, imperative to make. This is much more time-consuming, and at this point, I'm not sure what the ultimate outcome is going to be because it will take time to review. So, for instance, in each of the scope of work statements, it's noted that electrical outlets are replaced from the bottom 2 feet. I understand that these structures, for the most part, use electric baseboard heat, which are attached close to the floor. It's not clear to me whether the baseboard heat modules have been replaced or removed and reinstalled. I understand that hot water heaters were replaced. In some instances, I'm not sure of all. As an appliance of that nature, because it's hardwired, it counts towards structural improvement or damage repair. There are ongoing issues right through the document where the quantities and the estimates don't quite reconcile. So we have...
Do you have examples of those?
I think the one that comes to hand is cabinets. Cabinets purchased and then cabinets installed. We don't have yet any estimate or invoices from Brunel. We have the items from the subcontractors. We have blended.
What was it? There are.
We have fixed cost. We have fixed cost items from the subcontractors for drywall, electrical work, plumbing, and painting. They don't break out labor and materials. So Mr. Stevens did talk on that point, but it still presents some challenges there. That along with these changes are, like I said, they're an example.
And if I might add, just if I can, this revision and revision of estimate, the first set of numbers, the second set of numbers, and this now revised scope of work, narrowing down the amount of work, in large part, much of these revised numbers come from work that's already done, if I'm correct.
Not done.
None of this is done. You've not worked
Demolition.
at all with respect to any of these buildings.
Some of the demolition has been done, but...
To the chair. Thank you. The demolition has been done, but none of the work has been done on these 4 buildings.
No, they started a tiny bit of the sheetrock, but basically...
Then stopped.
Yeah, they just got started and a couple of them, and then shut down.
I think that, just remind me, that 230, the building that we considered at our last meeting, the work had been done there. Was that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, Bob.
My point being is if you can revise the figures based on work that was done at the time without a permit, I'll let the board decide how it wants to deal with its process for dealing with these types of substantial damage or cumulative improvements for the, always think of the next case. So I'll leave it at that, but there's, at least with 230, my understanding is that was done without a permit.
Mr. Chair, if I may, a couple of comments. A couple of things. Repeatedly you've been said to pick a process that's fair, equitable, and repeatable, I think was the terms.
Yep.
And I'm curious to see how the town is going to have a repeatable process if they want to go into each building and quantify how much insulation is in there. Have the other submittals that you've seen been sort of itemized at this level, gone through this level of detail? Seems to me you'd be there for a very long time. We're submitting an estimate based on a professional contractor. I fail to see the, I must say I'm a bit confused as to why it's being challenged at this level and questioned and undermined its veracity without any real expert testimony as to what should be a different number. If you want to take our estimates, bring it to a cost estimator, bring it to another contractor, and bring that in, that would be legitimate feedback, it seems to me. But to sit there and say, well, we need to look at this in more detail, and I didn't see this, I didn't see that, well, that's not the town planning staff. They're not contractors, they're not engineers, they're not estimators. Quite frankly, they're not qualified to review the estimate and say whether it's equitable or not. And the second thing, in terms of the violation and working without a permit, it's not before this board. If the town select board wants to issue a notice of violation and go after the housing authority, that's an action that's not really before this board, and as I understand it, and before this application. So I'm not sure why that keeps getting brought up in this forum. There's a perfectly good reason for why they got to where they are. All right, maybe it's not perfectly good. There's two sides to that equation. But everybody started this out in a mass of confusion back in August. And it's unfortunate that the two sides are sort of sitting here opposed and throwing darts back and forth. I don't think it needs to be that way. I'm sort of sorry that it is. But there's plenty of blame to go around on all sides. At this point, hopefully we can sort of focus on the facts that we've submitted and interpret what you can from the guidance. And hopefully, be Solomon and stand up there and figure out how you're going to cut the baby and come up with an answer for us.
There were 4 items that
Baseboard heat modules,
just address those 4 items. What
cabinets purchased versus cabinets installed,
and invoices from Mr.
costs.
Brunel.
Right. Baseboard heat, all the electrical work is in the electrical subcontractor's price. The cabinets aren't installed yet, so we were able to get prices because none of that's been done. So, the demo work is done, as John just said a minute ago. Demolition is stripping out, but not putting anything new back in other than a little bit of sheetrock.
So to be very specific, remove and reinstall wall heaters. That work that's just been questioned has been.
It's
in that estimate from the electrician.
Hot water heaters.
The hot waters are the plumber, and the electric heaters are the electrician.
Okay. And the hot water heaters were there they are there in the cost of improvements. Not in the main body, is that correct?
No, they were actually in the flood damage.
They're in the flood damage.
They're in the flood damage.
Yeah, because they had to come out.
They had to come out and get replaced. Some had to get rinsed out.
They had to come out to be able to get to the walls behind it. So a lot of this work is ancillary to fixing the walls. You got to move stuff away. You got to pull the sinks out. You got to pull the toilets out in order to get the sheetrock behind the toilets to replace it. So there's costs to remove the toilets and put the toilets back in. And those are the places where, by code, we would have put the old toilets back in, but we had to buy new fixtures because of the lead in them. So that's an example of where we had to go further.
And then I'll just take it just for one second, not to challenge it to the nth degree of detail, but on Jewett's plumbing and heating invoice, code compliance, hot water tank upgrades. It was definitely shifted.
No, upgrades of them. Just the thermostat that went on top of it, the old one didn't have. The actual hot water tank is in his initial flood repairs one.
Replace hot water.
Yeah, replace hot water tank. But they needed some additional gauges that weren't part of it.
Got it. I missed the upper line. Thank you.
And then the only other one I had was the fixed cost items from the subcontractor, no labor versus material breakout.
Yeah, we got a fixed price that lump sum number.
Okay.
We don't have to, we don't always get the labor and materials broken out. I don't know why you need that. It's the cost. We got it from a vendor.
I have a question. Mr. Stevens has assured us that the final bill is going to fall within the range that he's... Suppose it does, what happens? Suppose, in fact, when it's all done, the final bills are out, comes in at 51%. What happens?
Then the structures are subject to bringing up into code compliance. It's well defined in our...
He's exceeded the value that he's allowed to
That will
put
be the
in.
case at any time. It's a cumulative improvement. So that's the case at any time in the next 3 years. Should it...
My question is, if in fact what he says the estimates are tonight turn out to be much lower than the actual costs, what happens?
Much lower? Lower or higher?
What he's saying tonight is much lower than the
Then-
actual costs that
then-
come in, and in fact,
Then let me answer it the way that I think I can. Two things. I would expect the applicant to come back to the board and ask for some form of variance on that, some grace, and we could decide that at that point, because at that point we have substantial damage or substantial improvement, or the structures have to be brought up to code, and the applicant can decide how they might go about doing that. And of course, bringing brought up to code means, I think in this case, elevating the buildings by 1 foot. So they could decide how that might be achieved.
Riffing on Bob's earlier comment, this board can't describe whether this should happen. And I feel like people are trying to put that on as our responsibility. We don't have that jurisdiction. The zoning administrator doesn't have that jurisdiction. We don't tell people who come in and want to build a restaurant whether they should or should not do it, whether it is a wise or unwise thing. We're just doing math here. And I hope that the people who are involved in the decision about whether people should go back into these houses think about that and have a discussion and give it good and serious thought. Because our decision is not and cannot be that it is a good idea or it is proper and just. It is just math.
Thank you. My sentiments exactly. Carol, was it Carol? Chris, so I'm sorry.
Christine Connolly, Commissioner, Brattleboro Housing Authority. I actually have two questions, and one I had to laugh, and it's to Mr. Fisher.
To the board.
You can't hear me?
To the board.
Oh, okay, but no, I know, I'm just pointing, but I know it goes to you. He mentioned that we should go back to the second set of numbers that we came here for on the 7th, and we were told were not correct, and the town was arguing with. So why all of a sudden should we go back to these second set of figures? It makes no sense. It's almost like people are looking for arguments against everything that is being done by the Housing Authority. My second question was partially asked by Bob. Are we being held to the same standards as everyone else? I've been watching the meetings just to see how they work and everything like that. And as an example, when Discount Beverage came here, they threw in that, they thought they spent $50,000 on their gas tanks. Nobody had a receipt from them. Nobody had any detail from them. We're asking for details on insulation. I think that's actually a different standard that the town is asking for here from us than they ask for from other people.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
As you've referred to another case that came before the board,
Mhm.
it wasn't a question of spending $50,000 on gas tanks. We were determining the value of the gas tanks which were buried in the ground, and should that be a part of the...
But they had no
market value?
detail. They had no detail. He said, they're worth about $50,000.
That's correct.
And I mean, we're being asked for detail on pieces of insulation, and I mean, it just seems very, very different.
No, please. Within that equation, if we had the inclusion or exclusion of the gas tanks in the division that we were doing had no impact on the final decision that the board made, because it didn't shift the percentage of damage to the point where it was either 40% or 50%. Did not go over the threshold. It kept it at a very
Okay.
low price. So it had no impact on the decision that the board took at that point in time.
Okay, well,
If
I
it
still,
had- if-
I
if
still
they had
throw the
replaced the-
question out. Are we being held to the same standard of value
You-
as other
you
people
are
are?
being
From
held-
the town, from the town.
You are being held to the same standards.
Doesn't seem like it.
Michael Bosworth.
I came to the first hearing, and...
Can you give us a name, please?
Sure, you just said it, but
I
I'll
know.
repeat it.
We like you to affirm it.
Thanks for reminding me.
In case I get it wrong.
I sometimes forget.
Yeah.
Michael Bosworth, I'm from Brattleboro. I came to much of the first hearing, not all of it. I was in the back room here, and all of the hearing tonight. And, when I come to hearings like this, I'm not a zoning administrator, I'm not an engineer, I'm not a lawyer, so I try to process things as my mind sort of works through things logically. And I get the fact that, people have to, your board especially has to come up with something that's defensible, that's consistent, that's fair. So I very much appreciate that. And I've listened, and I've come to understand the difference between the assessed value, the appraised value, and the actual cash value. And, to me, assessed value is something you use oftentimes to determine what the taxes are. The appraised value, what you're going to be able to sell it at, which I don't think the Housing Authority is wanting to do. At the first hearing, I heard both the town position and the Housing Authority position, and I was confused, and I thought things were inconsistent. I couldn't process things very clearly. When I came tonight, I heard about actual cash value and how it was described, and how you determine also the damage in relation to that. For the first time, to me, that made a lot of sense about what are we trying to determine here? What's the actual damage that has occurred to the applicant, and compared to the value of what they have. So I just want to make sense. To me, it just makes the most logical sense as the one to use. That's what I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm looking for... Do you have any other questions? Yes, please. Looking for a motion for enter deliberative session.
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. Reconvene the December 5th Development Review Board meeting. As is customary on returning from deliberative session, we advise the applicant and the public of what we discussed in session, and split it into a few parts. The first part is that the Development Review Board, as a matter of policy, has determined that for fair market value, we will take and give the highest form to an appraisal provided by a licensed Vermont appraiser. So in the case of Brattleboro Housing Authority, we are accepting the appraisal provided by Dart Everett as the denominator in the equation or the calculation for substantial damage. We think it perfectly fit and reasonable for the zoning administrator to utilize the town assessed value when determining substantial damage as an initial first step, but that a qualified appraisal or appraiser provides us with the highest form of value for the properties, fair market value.
And to just make sure, we're not precluding any other, including the actual cash value, but we would prefer, and again, give the greatest
Greatest
deference
weight.
to,
Yep.
weight to an appraisal.
Correct. In terms of the recent estimates provided by Brattleboro Housing Authority and Bob Stevens and Associates, we're going to accept those estimates as is, with the following adjustment, that code improvements will be included in the value, and that gives us substantial damage percentages for building 159 at 44%, for building 165 at 37%, for building 246 at 43.91%, and for building 248, 45.15%. At this point, I'm looking for a motion
To overturn
to
the...
overturn or to uphold the appeal. Uphold the appeal.
No, the applicant will want... Well, yeah, to uphold the appeal, yes, okay.
I'm looking for a motion to uphold the appeal of Brattleboro Housing Authority.
So moved.
Second.
Having motion before us, all those in favour?
Well, before we vote, we should probably give some warning to the applicant, town, members of the public that our vote is a straw vote. We will formally close the evidentiary hearing tonight, but our decision doesn't issue until the chair signs a written decision. And that will take a while. This is a complicated and nuanced application which requires a thorough and formal decision. And we can't control and don't wish to control any of the other parties' behavior and actions, but just be forewarned that a written decision from this board will not emanate immediately. I'm sorry, so you had a motion and a second, we're about to vote.
Likewise, it will be conditioned such that, so that actual invoices and cost estimates, not cost estimates, actual invoices for work completed be supplied to the town of Brattleboro for keeping a record on substantial improvement with regard in relation to those buildings. So we have a motion and a seconder. All those in favour?
Aye.
Those against? I abstain. Motion passes 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 0, 1.
So we should continue the additional matter we have on the agenda.
Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Thank you.
We'll do that later.
Later. We have another application. We have another application.
We should continue that one. Because it's continued, do we have a date?
Yeah, no, it continues to January, the January meeting.
For the...
3rd? So that's January the 16th.
I've lost my...
Just I'll fill it in later.
January 16th is a holiday, does that move it automatically?
Moves it to the Wednesday, yeah, the 18th.
January 18th?
Because we won't do the 2nd, right? We're not going to do the 2nd. No, okay, there we go.
So application, do you know the number?
I'll fill it in.
Application...
Recovering from the first.
Yeah. Whetstone Station.
Excuse us, we're trying to finish the business here.
1 second, please. Application 2011-225 be continued to January the
18th. Second.
All those in favour?
Aye.
Those against? No, I abstain.
Oh, wait a minute, did we get
601.
paid for the planning board?